Good. So this morning I want to complete a conversation that we've been continuing for the last several weeks. For the last 2 weeks we've been talking about the Jewish 20th century and the two great catastrophes or crises that occurred in the Jewish 20th century, the Holocaust and the advent of the State of Israel. And I asked the question, what story will we tell? What is the mythology or the myth? What is the meaning that we'll draw from these great events? And when we relate these events to our children, what will we tell them? In the same way that the Seder tells the story of the Exodus, but it doesn't tell it as objective history. It draws meaning from the Exodus. The Exodus becomes the paradigm, the model for the way that a Jew reads history, the way that a Jew understands that God is involved in history and the ethics of human interaction in history. I think we're going to have to draw models. We're going to have to draw, on the same model as the Seder, we're going to have to draw lessons, first from the Holocaust and then from the advent, the invention of the State of Israel. And I asked you these last two times to consider what lessons we might draw. And we looked at many of the thinkers of the 20th century, 21st century, who have been meditating on this. Well, today's the third one in that series, but this isn't about a crisis. This is rather about a condition. And I think it's every bit as miraculous and every bit as surprising and every bit as revolutionary as the two events we've considered already, the Holocaust and the State of Israel. But we don't see it that way for some important reasons. And that's the creation of an American Jewish experience. Now, the reason we don't see it is because we live in it. We live it. And when you live it, you're in the middle of it. And when you're in the middle of something, you can't see it. Culture has been defined as that which is invisible to us. It's what's so normal, we don't even see it. Einstein once had a quip. He said, we don't know who discovered water. We just know one thing. It wasn't a fish. Because a fish is born in water, lives in water, dies in water, and never knows he's ever been in water. If you're living in it, you don't see it. You can't perceive it. It's only when you step outside of it and you look back at it from another vantage point that you can say, oh, wow, look at that. That's interesting. That's interesting. So that's one of the reasons why people who come to this culture from outside teach us something very important, because they can help us point to the things that are interesting in our own culture that we who have grown up in it can't even see it. That's why if you travel, there's a wonderful experience of travel. Travel has two experiences. Going to another place, another culture, you get to notice that culture. And then when you come home, there's a slight sense of strangeness for the first 48 hours. And you come home and you say, oh, wow. I remember the first time I spent a year in Israel studying at the Hebrew University. And one of the things, you're going to find this very prosaic, but for me this is very important, right? So I came back, and on the way back from the airport, my pop said, are you hungry? I said, yeah. So we stopped at the IHOP to get breakfast, you know? And the waitress comes around with the coffee pot and says, can I fill your cup of coffee? Well, they never do that in Israel. In Israel, in Europe too, you buy a cup of coffee. That's it. You want another one? Buy another one. You don't have anyone who comes around saying, can I fill up your cup of coffee? And suddenly you say, ooh, what a wonderful place is America, you know? It's just one of these tiny little things that you notice that you would not have noticed living in the culture. You have to step outside of it. So that's the first reason why we don't see the American Jewish experience as unique and precious and miraculous, because we are the American Jewish experience. The second reason we don't see it is because it's an ongoing story. Right? If you were to interview a German, this is a horrible example, but let me give it to you anyway. If you were to interview a German Jew in 1925 and ask him or her what German Jewry is like, they would tell you it's a golden age. Right? It's only what happened subsequently that turned what was supposed to be a golden age into a nightmare. And we're in the middle of that experience. We're still in the midst of the experience. What happens tomorrow will affect the way that we understand what happens today and what happens yesterday. That's a fact, by the way, of personal biography, as well as it's a fact of communal history, right? A person lives a life and you think you understand them, and then they do something or something happens to them, and that whole life now gets recast. That whole life gets changed overnight. right? So that's why it's an interesting thing to do when I'm a rabbi and I have to give a eulogy. It's really only after the person has finally died that you can look back and tell the story of the life. And even then you really can't tell it, because what his or her children or descendants or students will do might change the essence of that life. Well, because we're still living the story of the American Jewish experience, it's hard to characterize it, because something might happen tomorrow that'll change everything the way we saw yesterday. But nevertheless, let's take a jump, because I happen to think that the American Jewish experience is unique. And I'm going to try to make the case to you that no experience of the Jewish people in all of its history matches this one. We have lived everywhere. You know that, right? There are Jews in Iceland. Verves, you know? there's Jews everywhere. You know, there's a Chabad everywhere, right? In fact, there's so many Chabads that they're starting to build a Chabad in a Chabad. Right? Chabad's like Starbucks of the Jewish people, right? Wherever you go, there's one, right? On Ventura Boulevard, I'm not kidding, there is a Chabad every mile down Ventura Boulevard. No, I'm serious. There's Sherman Oaks, and then Encino, and then Tarzana, and then Woodland Hills, you know, on into, you know, and yeah, but that just says that there's Jewish people everywhere, right? We've lived in every culture, we've lived in every land, we lived under every sorts of circumstance. I'd like to make the case that no place has been as welcoming as America. There have been communities that tolerated us and allowed us to live among them. There have been communities where we lived among them for a very long time and prospered and flourished. But there's no community that has ever welcomed the Jew the way America did, for a very simple reason. Because America happens to be a culture of immigrants, a culture of people who came from elsewhere, we become one of the masses and not an extraordinary case. In France, we're an extraordinary case. We're not quite French. In Germany, in Italy, in England. But in America, we're just another one of the great peoples of this country. And because of that, we have had not just been tolerated to live our own lives, which is one gift, but more than that, we have been invited to participate in the formation of the larger culture. We've been invited to participate and to contribute to the formation of the larger culture. This in both profound ways and somewhat kitschy, cheeky, trivial ways. In a little while, we'll take a look at Adam Sandler's famous Hanukkah song. Right? Now you consider that for just a minute. On national television, on one of the highest rated programs of national television, a national comedian, a guy who everybody recognizes, and incidentally, his name is Adam Sandler. A generation ago, he would have changed that name to Adam Sands, right? A generation ago, because you all know that Kirk Douglas wasn't Kirk Douglas. He's Isser Danilovich, right? And Burt Lancaster isn't Burt Lancaster. And Tony Curtis was Bernie Schwartz, right? Right? And you change your nose, you change your name, you change your ethnicity. But Adam Sandler, and even Jerry Seinfeld, who's not exactly ethnically Jewish, but his name is still Seinfeld. And not, not something more Anglo. So Adam Sandler stands in front of America and sings this song about Jewish ethnic pride. You realize we're 2.5% of the country. Now, if you live in New York City, this makes a certain amount of sense, because half of Manhattan's Jewish, right? But if you live in Nebraska or Iowa, what the hell did they think of that, right? Like, who is this boy, you know? But you have to understand that no culture has ever invited us to participate. I mean, again, one of the reasons for that is because the core American narrative and the core Jewish narrative are so congruent. What's the core American narrative? You all say it on the fourth Thursday of every November, right? Our pilgrim ancestors faced persecution in England, and so they decided to flee to a new place where they could live in freedom. They boarded small boats and crossed the Atlantic and came to these shores, to Plymouth, Massachusetts, which on a good day is a forbidding place, right? And starving and dying of the diseases, the natives came and they invited them in and welcomed them and taught them how to live in this continent. And a year later, they had a feast of Thanksgiving, which we replicate every year. Now, we can argue the historicity of those events. I mean, we always carefully leave out the end of the story, which is they said grace, washed the dishes, slaughtered the Indians, and stole the continent from them, right? But the point is that is a biblical story. That is the Exodus narrative, right? And all of us can fit ourselves into that narrative because all of us came to this country from someplace else. All of us came seeking liberty. All of us found it a difficult place. All of us were given a hand by those who lived here. All of us did okay, and all of us now give thanksgiving for the gifts of this continent. That's everybody's story, Jewish as well as non-Jewish, and it parallels the Exodus story. My friend Leonard Feinstein, who's a great rabbi and professor, once said, it's a damn good thing they ate a turkey, because if they'd eaten a ham, we'd have been screwed. I mean, think about that for just a minute, right? Even the food is accessible to us, right? If it had been the Thanksgiving ham, it had felt very foreign to us, right? This way you can go to the butcher shop and spend $6.95 a pound on a kosher turkey, while your non-Jewish neighbor spends 29 cents a pound on that turkey's brother, All right, fine, okay, so we get ripped off. But the point is, the American narrative, the American core narrative, and the American Jewish narrative are very much, and the Jewish narrative, the biblical narrative, very much congruent with each other. Well, that gives us a place to be here. It gives us a certain cultural invitation. Yes, there's anti-Semitism. There's anti-Semitism now, there was anti-Semitism yesterday, and there will be anti-Semitism tomorrow. 2 generations ago, that anti-Semitism was acute. And some of you are old enough to remember it was bad. You remember it. I mean, there were neighborhoods Jews didn't live in. There were industries Jews didn't work in. There were colleges Jews couldn't go to. There were clubs Jews couldn't participate in. Right? Remember the old joke, Groucho Marx was once invited to the Los Angeles Country Club by one of his producers. His kids were splashing in the wading pool. And the manager came over and said, Mr. Marx, I'm sorry, you're going to have to take your children out of the pool. It's a restricted club. And Mark said, listen, they're only half Jewish. Let them go up to their waist, So the Hillcrest Country Club and El Cab were created because Jews couldn't join the LA Country Club in the Riviera. And Cedars Sinai was created because Cedars of Lebanon was created because Jewish doctors couldn't practice in the Catholic and Protestant hospitals, right? And frankly, if you fly into Los Angeles, this is a whole nother lecture, you know that there's 2 downtowns. You can see it from the air, right? There's the core downtown, and then there's the Wilshire Corridor leading up to Century City and Westwood. That was because of Jews. What happened was, in the original Los Angeles, which was Catholic, Jews and Catholics worked together to build the inner city. The first mayor of Los Angeles was Jewish, right? There were 8 Jews in the city. 3 of them served on the city council, wouldn't you know? Right? We built the center of this city. And then what happened is after the First World War, there was a great emigration from the Midwest to Los Angeles, and the city turned from Catholic to Protestant. The Protestants were viciously anti-Semitic, and they pushed the Jews out of the center city. So Jews did what Jews always did. We adapted. We said, fine, you don't want us, we'll create our own downtown. They decentralized the development of the city, but mostly they built an alternative downtown, which is the Wilshire Corridor, Century City, and Westwood, right? So there's 2 downtowns. There's the one that we go to and the one they won't let us go to, right? No, seriously, that's how Los Angeles developed. The development of the valley was pushed by Jewish property developers and bankers as a way of getting even with the Protestants downtown who wouldn't let us invest there. So we decentralized the city. You don't have to go downtown to go shopping. In New York, you go downtown to go shopping. In Chicago, you go downtown to go shopping, right? In Detroit, you go downtown to go shopping. In LA, you go to the mall. No, seriously, this was done on purpose as the Jewish bankers were trying to choke off the commerce of downtown. And the person who saw this and realized that it was a mistake was Buffy Chandler. And Buffy Chandler, who was the wife of Norman Chandler, her name was Dorothy Chandler, but everyone called her Buffy, us friends of hers, right? And Buffy Chandler saw this was a mistake, so when she was building the music center in 1960, she made a critical decision, right? Her family raised the money for one of the 3 buildings, and she needed more money, so she went and had lunch with Mark Taper, at the Hillcrest Country Club. Buffy Chandler, the matron of downtown Goyish society, went to the Jewish Hillcrest Country Club and sat down with the Jewish banker, Mark Taper, and asked him for a contribution. And Taper, who understood what he was being asked, offered her $1 million on the condition that Howard Amundsen, who was a vicious anti-Semite, he owned Home Savings, would match it. And when Amundsen found out that the Jew Taper gave $1 million, he gave $1.25 million. And that's why the three buildings in the Music Center are the Chandler Pavilion, the Taper Forum, and the Amundsen Theater, right? Protestant Catholic Jew. Buffy realized that we need to bring the city together. That was her great dream. That's why the Music Center is named the way it is. So what happens is there has always been anti-Semitism, but it's been growing less and less effective. So some of you grew up with it. Went to neighborhoods where you got beat up on your way to Hebrew school, made choices in your life. My children never had to make a choice because of anti-Semitism. Never had to choose what college to go to or not go to, what industry to enter or not enter. Children don't even understand this kind of stuff now, right? They don't deal with that kind of anti-Semitism. That's the new American reality. Or to put it in very graphic terms, the president of Princeton is Jewish. Well, put it better. The two people who ran for president in the last election, their grandchildren are all Jewish, right? Well, no, seriously. Mrs. Clinton's daughter is married to a Jew, and Mr. Trump's daughter is married to a Jew, and that wasn't a problem in the election. When Lieberman ran for vice president, that wasn't a problem. In fact, it was a kudo. He's a religious man. That's an amazing thing. So, what happened? We became welcome to this country. So let's take a look at the American Jewish experience, shall we? Everybody take a breath. We came to this continent early, 350 years ago. The first settlers came from Recife in Brazil to Manhattan, and Peter Stuyvesant didn't want to let them in. So what they did was they quickly emailed the board of directors of the Dutch West Indies Company and said, what the hell, right? The Dutch West Indies Company, which was Peter Stuyvesant's employer, wrote him back and said, schmuck, half of the board of this company are Jewish merchants. Let them in or you're fired. So we entered Manhattan. We got to come to Manhattan. We've been in this country since the very beginning, since the 1600s. The first communities were organized around the American Revolution, and there were communities in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Savannah, Charleston, New York. The first synagogue built in the country was the Torah Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. The first rabbi to come to these United States was Abraham Rice, who came from Bavaria in 1840. He was a traditionalist. He came to a congregation in Baltimore. He came with the express purpose to bring true Jewish faith to America. None of this America backsliding and compromising. He was going to be truly faithful. He was going to show them what real European Frumkeit looked like. He lasted 2.5 years. Sent a letter to his sister in Bavaria saying, these people are barbarians, they're goyim, I don't want to do this anymore, quit the rabbinate, opened a grocery store. I don't know if he's any more successful in the grocery business than he was in the rabbinate, because he didn't understand. And what he didn't understand was beautifully grasped by a contemporary of his, a man by the name of Isaac Leeser. Isaac Leeser was not an ordained rabbi, but he was an educated Jew, so he got himself a job as the chazan, which means cantor and then minister, that was his title, of the Mikveh Yisrael congregation in Philadelphia, which was ostensibly a Portuguese Sephardic synagogue, and even though he was German, they hired him anyway. Leeser realized that America was different. Unlike Europe, where Jewish communities had legal powers, and there was one Jewish community with legal power in each town in Europe. So if you wanted to be buried in the cemetery, if you wanted to eat kosher food, if you wanted the help and support of the community, you had to join and pay dues and be obedient to the community. In America, religion is a voluntary thing. You can't force people to be Jewish. Leeser understood all the implications of that. So he understood that if you're going to get people to be Jewish in America, you have to persuade them. You can't force them. So what did he do? The first thing he did was translate the Bible into English. There had not been an English translation under Jewish auspices, only the King James Version. So he created the first Jewish English translation so that American Jews could read the Bible. Then he began giving sermons in English. Then he realized that kids needed Jewish background. So with a woman named Rebecca Gratz, who was a single school teacher, she was an unmarried school teacher, he created the first Sunday school. He also created the first press, what would eventually become the Jewish Publication Society of America, and started printing Jewish books. In other words, he created a whole community organization. He was improvising all the way. He needed to create something that was purely American. That's what he did. And in that combination between Rice and Leeser, you can see two different approaches to American Judaism. Rice, who thought that he could bring European Judaism to America, and Leeser, who understood America is different. You have to improvise, create something brand new. And that was Leeser's contribution. In the next generation, you had a similar conversation. What happened soon is you had communities up and down the eastern seaboard. The community in Baltimore began to get these ideas from Germany of changing their worship service, what was then called Reform. Reform Judaism, and that meant, what it meant was having an organ play in the service, right? Doing sermons in the vernacular. So the rabbi introduced an organ, and the congregation rebelled, and they split, and the more traditionalist side of the congregation sued the board of the congregation. Jews have not changed. The suit went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court said, "Are you kidding? Get out of here." And they threw the case out. And the congregations basically remained split, but you had the beginning of reform in America. And again, you had two different sort of poles. There were those who wanted to maintain European-style tradition, and there were those who wanted to bring all kinds of changes to this American Judaism. But following the Civil War, it became clear that the split was going to be very difficult. Following the Civil War, there was a huge rise in anti-Semitism and a huge rise in missionary activity. Christian churches reaching out to Jewish kids and trying to drag them into Christianity. The person who saw the threat in the disunity of the community was a rabbi by the name of Isaac Mayer Wise. Isaac Mayer Wise was a Cincinnati rabbi, and he realized we need to bring all these people together. The word that was popular at the end of the Civil War was union. So the first thing he did was create an organization of American congregations called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. And it didn't matter if you were traditional or reform. This was a place for Jews to have common cause, right? Then he created a conference of rabbis called the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and then he decided to create the first seminary, and he called it Hebrew Union College. And Hebrew Union College was located in his synagogue in Cincinnati. And in 1876, graduated their very first class of American-born, English-speaking, unifying rabbis. Only problem was that he wasn't in charge of the dinner. So after the graduation, beautiful ordination ceremony, they all went across the street to the Highland House Hotel. And the Highland House Hotel, they all sat down to dinner, and the waiters came around and gave them the menu. Now, that menu, if you ever think about, like, how trafe can it be? There's a restaurant in Brooklyn, by the way, called Trafe. Did you know this? This is a true story. There's a restaurant in Brooklyn called Trafe, and it's run by some former Orthodox Jews, because only someone who knows the laws of kosher could have created such a menu. Well, the same thing happened to poor Isaac Mayer Wise. The reformers who were trying to break out of this, what they thought were the constraints of his traditionalism, created a menu which only someone who had studied the Bible very carefully could have written. Like the meal started with a shrimp cocktail, right? And then it was, it went on to beef with bacon sauce and cheese for dessert. You couldn't have created a more trafe menu. What happened is all the traditionalists got up, they walked out. The traditionalists founded a conservative movement. The reformers won, they created a reform movement. The Orthodox decided they didn't want to talk to these guys anymore, and so we denominationalized. That was the next generation of American Jews. But all of that didn't really matter, because starting in 1880, the Great Immigration came. 2.5 million Eastern European Jews came. Just before that, to give you a sense of who we were just before that, this editorial ran in the New York Herald newspaper. New York Herald was Pulitzer's newspaper, right? We're not talking about the Jewish Journal here. This is the New York Times. It wasn't Times at the time, it was the Herald. This is an editorial, right? To maintain Judaism in America, something more than a mere recitation of prayers in Hebrew and German, because all the Jews who lived in New York were German at the time, is necessary. The people are much more intelligent than they were a century or half a century ago. That's a great statement, isn't that? Right? And any religious system that keeps not up with the progressive spirit of the age must expect to meet such crises as this, in which the Jewish church in America now finds itself. The rising generations demand a form of religion which their hearts can appreciate and hold fast to, though they ask for no change in the true spirit of religion at all. And it is the attempt to confine them to the iron bands of the system of bygone ages, what a great phrase, that has produced results which the Hebrew press so generally and frequently lament, namely that the young Israelites do not manifest that love for the synagogue which their fathers and forefathers showed. Rightly understood, this very religious indisposition is a sign of progress, which calls loudly and earnestly on the Jewish church to furnish such spiritual food as young American souls can digest. 1872, meaning what? We have this myth that we all came as Orthodox, turned into conservatives, turned into Reform, and then turned into Episcopalians. It's always been an up and down, and it has always been a challenge to engage the children of immigrants. Immigrants come with their own ways and practices and languages, but their children who grow up in America, because their ambition is to become Americanized, will typically turn against their parents' faith and traditions. That's always been the pattern. Then the third generation comes back and recovers some of that faith, and the community begins to adjust. The problem is that the institutions of the community are always a generation behind, which is to say that every generation gets the synagogue their parents would have been proud of, right? So in 1872, you have now the children of the German immigrants who came in the 1840s. The children of those immigrants are rejecting Jewish life and looking for something American. But the institutions haven't caught up because the institutions are still involved in protecting what was instead of imagining what could be. The same thing is going to happen again. This huge wave of Eastern European immigration starts coming in 1880. The biggest year for immigration was 1912. It's going to get cut off with the coming of the First World War in 1914. And finally, in 1920, America is going to pass very restrictive immigration laws and cut off American immigration from Eastern Europe altogether. That's the first generation. But what happened in the second generation? To those who were born on the Lower East Side or in Brooklyn or on the South Side of Chicago. What happened to that generation is that they began to turn against their parents' forms because they identified their parents' forms of identification as greenhorn, as crudely immigrant. They wanted to be Americans. They wanted to be Americans. The reason why my teacher's name was Harold Maurice Schulweis was because his European-born mother wanted to give him a good Anglo name. She wanted her son to become American. So she opened the newspaper, and guess what it said right in the front? New York Herald. No, I'm not kidding. That's how he got the name. Zvi Hirsch is his Hebrew name. My name is Edward. I asked my mother one. You know my mother. My mother spoke fluent Yiddish and fluent Hebrew. I said, Mom, where did you ever get Edward from? Right? You know, I'm Edward. My brother's Lawrence. My third brother's Stephen. By the fourth one, she relented. She called him Jeremy. I said, Edward. She said, the Prince of England's name was Edward. I wanted you to be American. She said, I never felt comfortable in this country. I spoke Yiddish. My English was never very good. I wanted to be American. Second generation American Jew. This is the second generation. So here comes, in 1925, the New York Board of Jewish Ministers. That's what it was called, okay? The New York Board of Rabbis. The New York Board of Jewish Ministers holds a 2-year conference trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a rabbi today? It's an and they print the proceedings. Each great rabbi of the age, and this was the golden age of American rabbis, gave a paper. This rabbi talks about the child in the synagogue. His name is Israel Goldfarb. He's the rabbi of the Kane Street Synagogue in Brooklyn, which today is a really hot place. Israel Goldfarb is known for two important things besides being the rabbi, or three, of the Kane Street Synagogue in Brooklyn. He was also an instructor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Jewish music. He wrote the melody for Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharei. He wrote that melody. And not just that melody, he did Aaron Copland's bar mitzvah. So Appalachian Spring was the theme of the bar mitzvah. And actually, you'll see in just a moment, the third thing he's known for is he invented the bar mitzvah. You'll see that in a minute. Here's what Goldfarb says. Listen carefully. This is 1927. So all of you who think that we are the descendants of really, really, really traditional Jews and we have backslided, listen to 1927 talking to you. Of all the problems that beset the American rabbi of today, none is more complex and difficult to solve than how to bring the child closer to the synagogue, how to arouse his interest in things Jewish and secure his permanent attachment to the ideals and faith of our people. This problem, which is of vital importance to the future of Judaism in America, was completely unknown to our predecessors a generation ago, particularly in the more established communities of the Old World, where Jewish life was settled and well-ordered and Jewish practice been crystallized for centuries. The child not only learned his religious duties by precept, but largely by example. The atmosphere in which he moved, lived, developed, and grew was 100% Jewish. His environment was charged with a sublime spirit that led him to adopt a wholesome Jewish life. See, here's the pattern. The pattern is every generation looks backwards and says, they were so good. We are so bad, right? Here in America, however, where the Jew has lost his firm grip on his ancient heritage and where his loyalty to traditions of his fathers is weakened so much, here where the child moves from morning until night in a non-Jewish atmosphere, the question of inspiring his interest in the synagogue becomes a difficult task indeed. We are confronted with the fact that neither the home nor the synagogue, as they're constituted today, any longer exert that magnetic power over the child, nor generate any longer that spiritual force which in formal generations influenced the child's life and made him conscious of his Jewish responsibilities. Our American synagogues are, with few exceptions, without traditions. Their foundations are not rooted in the firm rock of Israel's historic experience, but are, spiritually speaking, flimsy, tottering structures swayed by the slightest wind that threatens their collapse. Their education systems disorganized and faulty, their religious services mechanical, lacking in decorum, uniformity, and sincerity and spiritual enthusiasm. Is it any wonder that that under these conditions, such as these, the Jewish child is crushed between the upper and nether stones of indifference and neglect, and his Jewish consciousness is nipped in the bud beyond resurrection, ere it has a chance to blossom forth and bear fruit. So what is he saying to you? We can't get kids in shul. And this is 1927. Why? Because they're the children of immigrants. So what did he do? So he created a ritual, which does not exist in the tradition. Bar mitzvah in the tradition is a very, very, very tiny, small, not very important thing. He made it a big deal. The first thing he did was started teaching kids for their bar mitzvah himself. And then he would invite their parents and their friends. And he'd make a big deal about it. Then what he did was he got a caterer to move in next door. No, I'm not kidding. And he created bar mitzvah dinners and lunches, right? I don't know if he had photo booths and all this other chazarah they got. But he created what we call the bar mitzvah. He made the bar mitzvah a big deal because now that gave a reason for the kids' education up to age 13. And then he made a really lovely discovery. The kids who'd studied with him for bar mitzvah, they wanted to continue to study with him. So he created the Akiva Society on Saturday afternoon, where they would learn a little Bible, eat a little food, and go play some basketball together. He created the first Jewish youth group. And then the girls wanted to come. So he created the Rachel Society, the first Jewish girls' youth group. He creates this whole thing. He was never trained in any of this stuff. He was trained as a Talmudist. All of this was improvised. New institutions for a new set of circumstances in a new country with new problems and new possibilities. And this is what happens in the 1920s. The 1920s and 30s is the sort of growth of that kind of style of American Judaism. Then comes the Depression, and all of that is put on hold, and then comes the war, right? Then comes some of you were around during that time, I wasn't. But the war disturbed everything because so many thousands and thousands of men and women, but mostly men, left the community, and family life and everything was a mess. Everything was upset. But what happens in 1945 when the war ends? You have all of these GIs coming back, and they want to pick up life where they left off. So they get married, and they begin building families. And following the war, you have something called the baby boom. The birth rate for American women goes from 1.5 children per woman to 3.8 child per woman. In other words, big families, lots of kids, from 1945 until it starts to wane in the 1970s. Then you need some place to live. You have all these families, these growing families, and no place to live. So what happens? Right? Well, you have a wonderful man named Levitt. Anyone ever hear of Mr. Levitt? Levitt worked in an aircraft plant during the war. How did we build airplanes during the war? Before the war, you built airplanes one at a time. You had a crew of mechanics, and they built an airplane. But the country needed thousands of airplanes, thousands of tanks, thousands of trucks. So what did they do? They applied Henry Ford's mechanical systems, assembly line systems, to the building of airplanes. And that's how we built thousands of airplanes and tanks and weapons for the war. Well, Levitt applies the same idea to houses. Except you can't put houses on an assembly line, but you can put the workers on an assembly line. So he buys a big tract of empty land in Long Island, New York, and for the first time he builds 1,000 homes. They all look alike. You can pick out a little bit, you can change the color, you can move the garage to the other side, but fundamentally you're going to get a 2-bedroom house with a kitchen and a backyard and a little patio, and it's going to cost you $700, right? Cheap houses and cheap land, tract housing. And because he had a small ego and was a humble man, he called it Levittown. Then he built another one in New Jersey, Levittown. Now it's called Cherry Hill, right? The same thing was built here in Los Angeles. Baldwin Park was the first tract housing, right? These were tract housing. And you have GI families. Now there was a GI Bill, so you could go to college and get a job. There was employment bills, and you could borrow money as an FHA loan as a veteran, and you could afford a house. And they moved out of the city neighborhoods, out of the Lower East Side, out of Brooklyn, out to Long Island, out to New Jersey, up to Highland Park and Glencoe, right? Out to the suburbs. Canoga Park, California. You know my dad. I don't know why he's not here today. My dad had a stroke 10 years ago and is disabled, gets around just fine. And he said to me, Ed, you know what we discovered? I said, what? He says, our house, the house I grew up in Canoga Park, he says, it was built for disabled veterans. I said, really? He said, yeah. Do you ever wonder why the light switches were so low? And why the doorways were so wide? And why it was all built on one plane with no stairs? I thought they built it for kids. That's why, you know. No, it was built for disabled. In Canoga Park, Valley Park homes were built for disabled American veterans, right? So now that the house is perfect for a person who has a little trouble getting around. They built the whole thing. Every house on the block looks the same, right? There's actually 3 models, and you have to choose, right? Remember little houses on the hillside, and they're all made out of tiki-taki, and they all look just the same, remember? This is suburbia. Now, but what happened to these communities? So now all of a sudden in Levittown, in Valley Park, in Glencoe, you have huge communities of young Jews separated from the neighborhoods of their origins, separated from their parents and their grandparents, and they realize that they can't schlep downtown to go to shul Shabbos or to educate the kids, so they start creating suburban synagogues. Here is the membership brochure for the Israel Community Center, Levittown, New York, 1948. Listen. This is the membership brochure. You got this when you walk in. Many of our people had little previous contact with synagogue life. having hitherto regarded the synagogue as the province of their elders. Many have not seen the inside of a shul since their bar mitzvah. Now, however, they feel that it's time that they grow up, and they have consequently acquired a renewed interest in synagogue activity. The responsibilities of parenthood have led many to rethink their position with regard to the Jewish heritage, which they now seek to maintain in order to be able to transmit it to their children. In Levittown, this return to Judaism is facilitated for them through the existence of a synagogue consisting of like-minded young Jewish parents. Don't turn the page yet. Anybody grow up in this synagogue? I did. This was a synagogue that was devoted to children. The most popular service was the family service, once a month on Friday night. That was at 7:30. We'd sing all the songs. Billy was there. You grew up with me. A Hebrew school class led the service, and the rabbi told the story, right? Bar mitzvah was the center experience, and high holidays, of course. The purpose of the synagogue was to train kids for bar mitzvah, which you could already begin to see is somewhat paradoxical, right? You're saying to children, the reason you have to have a Jewish education is so you can have a bar mitzvah. And the kid says, and then what? And then you don't have to do it anymore. It's like driver's education. Like once you get the license, you never have to go back and take the test again, right? So what happens is you have a synagogue by, of, and for children. There are no real adults in which to show models of Jewish spirituality. It's all for kids. It's really a Hebrew school and next to a synagogue, or a synagogue and next to a Hebrew school. The sisterhood becomes the PTA of the Hebrew school. The men's club exists, right? Well, the men's club exists because those were the guys that weren't rich enough to be on the board at a shul, but they wanted to be in charge of something, so they were in charge of the picnics, the Purim carnivals, the Hanukkah fairs, the summer camps, all of the kind of fun things in the shul. But the whole thing is focused on children. It's all focused on children, because the idea here is we're not Jewish for our own benefit. We want to transmit it. The central imperative of suburban Judaism post-war is not to live Jewishly, or to know Jewish, or to engage in Jewish, but to transmit it, but to transmit Judaism. So what sermon did the rabbi give? Over and over and over and over again. You all heard it 1,000 times. What did the rabbi say to you? In one way or another, what did the rabbi say? Come on, fess up. What? Yes. The real sermon was the obligation to survive. The obligation to survive. It's what we said last week from Emil Fackenheim's writing. Don't give Hitler the posthumous victory. Survival becomes the ideology of the community. Survival becomes the reason for the community. And survival carries this tremendous responsibility of transmitting Judaism and a tremendous load of guilt as the emotional hammer to make it happen. Right? Why aren't you in Shul Shabbos? Well, don't you want Judaism to survive? Right? That was the sort of method. That was the method to the madness. Right? That was post-war American suburban Judaism. Right? Yes? Oh, it worked great. Yes. Right. Turn the page. Turn the page. So Jack Wertheimer, who's a wonderful historian of American Judaism, here's just a little bit of snippet from Jack, right? In 1957, the Synagogue Council of America, that's the big sort of umbrella organization, estimated a grand total of 4,200 congregations, more than double the number of 50 years earlier. So right after the war, there was this explosion of synagogue building all over the country, right? Right? And about 1,000 more than immediately before World War II. Right? This synagogue was built in 1950. It was founded in 1950 and built on this site in 1952. VBS was one of those suburban synagogues. Right? In 1 year, they added like 150 synagogues to the country. However, here's the paradox. People built synagogues People supported synagogues financially, but, yes, attendance at religious service, by contrast, did not keep pace with membership growth. That's a great, subtle sentence. A survey conducted by the National Opinion Research Center, that's Michigan, in 1945 found that only 24% of Jews claimed to attend religious services at least once a month, compared to 81% of Catholics and 62% of Protestants. A mere 9% claimed to attend once a week. By 1970, the National Jewish Population Survey determined that only 8% of Jewish household heads attended religious services 50 times a year or more, whereas percent attended fewer than 4 times, or a greater percent attended fewer than 4 times a year. All right, so what happened? Why didn't they go to shul? Well, actually it wasn't. Most people got time off Shabbos. Where were they Shabbos? Shopping, tennis, golf. Who was shul for? Kids. You dropped your kids off and you went to go do what you needed to do, and then you picked them up, right? The only time you went was when, right? So here you have this interesting paradox. And I'm not making fun of it, because it's a very interesting paradox. A community which takes its existence seriously enough to want to give it to its children. That's admirable. That's deep, but not enough to practice it himself, right? Which is a strange paradox of American Judaism. That's post-war Judaism, okay? Mark. Yeah. Yeah, the shul with the pool is actually a model that was created in the 1930s. It was a model that was was the other answer, or the extension of the answer to Israel Goldfarb. When Israel Goldfarb is dealing with second-generation American Jews, Jews whose parents came in 1912, 1914, and they were born in the 1920s, and they weren't coming to synagogue, Mordechai Kaplan, Israel Leventhal, Israel Goldstein, a great group of powerful American rabbis, made this decision to create something called the Synagogue Center. The Synagogue Center was a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week institution in which religious life was only a small part of it. The bigger part was recreation. A gym, classes, recreation stuff, cultural activities. Kaplan's idea that anything Jews do is Judaism. So if Jews play basketball, that's Jewish basketball, right? So you had YMHAs and you had JCCs, but more than that, you had synagogues all over the country that were taking up this model. The model was that if we can gather Jews for cultural activities, gather Jews for English classes if they're immigrants, gather Jews for cooking classes, dance classes, yoga classes, basketball leagues, summer camps, they'll stay in the synagogue for Jewish cultural enrichment as well. The Synagogue Center. The most famous one was the Brooklyn Jewish Center. The Brooklyn Jewish Center, Israel Leventhal was the rabbi, and he had such a great taste. I'll give you a sense of who the Brooklyn Jewish Center was. The cantor was Richard Tucker, who became the great star of the Metropolitan Opera. The drama and social director was Moss Hart, who left the Brooklyn Jewish Center to join Oscar Hammerstein and write Broadway plays, right? Rodgers and Hart. I mean, Richard Rodgers, right? And the art director was Mart Rothko, who was Mordechai Rosenstein once, because he had a sense that if you're going to offer this stuff, offer the best. Now, here's the irony of our dear friend and my teacher and friend, Rabbi Zeldin, right? Zeldin, when he builds Stephen Wise Temple, is building that, a Jewish center. Stephen S. Wise, the namesake of that place, hated that idea. Stephen Wise gave a very famous address to the graduating class of the Hebrew Union College in which he said, look, if you have to attract people with a swimming pool, with a gymnasium, with a bowling alley, and not with the things you teach and say from Torah, you're a pretty pathetic rabbi. Now, I don't know whether Zeldin never read that sermon, never heard that sermon. He was Stephen Wise's secretary, right? But Wise didn't like this idea. Wise created a synagogue called Stephen Wise. We'll spend a morning on him one day. fact, what I want to do is a series on people that places are named for. So we're going to do Stephen Wise, Abraham Heschel, Solomon Schechter. We're going to do all the places that people know. Stephen Wise was a great New York rabbi. He was born in New York. Born in Europe, educated in New York, went back to Europe to get his smicha, was rabbi in Portland, Oregon for 6 years, was interviewed to be the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel in New York City, but didn't take the job. Came back a year later and started his own synagogue called the Free Synagogue. Free Synagogue meant they didn't charge you to come, they didn't charge you dues, and he could say whatever he wanted. Now he decided, it really wasn't a synagogue, it was really a forum for Stephen Wise to speak. It met at Carnegie Hall on Sunday mornings. And it was broadcast on the radio. He packed Carnegie Hall every Sunday morning for 30 years. And the idea was, it wasn't that he didn't know that Shabbos was Shabbos. He said, you go to your shul Shabbos and you come hear me on Sunday mornings. Right? Not a bad model. And Wise was this powerful orator who was very political. And Republican, by the way. Very, very, very political. And that was his model of American Judaism. He created an adult Judaism that rivaled what Goldfarb was creating, which was this juvenile Judaism that took hold after the war. Unfortunately, you had to be Stephen Wise in order to do it, because you had to be that kind of an orator. Okay? Let's take one more step. Let's answer Sherry's question. What happened next? What happened next is that starting in about the 1990s, this model of juvenile Judaism began to deteriorate. For a really simple reason. Kids asked, why be Jewish? Why be Jewish? Right? Why should I be Jewish? And the parents gave them all the answers that the parents had learned, right? Because Hitler killed 6 million. And the kids said, but why should I be Jewish? Why does that give me a reason to be Jewish? What is my connection with things Jewish? Now what happened then is that the community began to change. And you all were here. You saw what happened, right? What happened is, on the one hand, there's a tremendous disaffection and disaffiliation from the community. Because if you didn't get an answer to the question, why be Jewish? If you didn't get something that had added to your life, some kind of a connection, there was no sense in investing yourself in this. But then what happened is that, again, I told you, the institutions changed slower than ideologies. Slowly, institutions began to catch up. One of the people who saw this clearest was Harold Schulweis. Harold Schulweis saw everything 20, 30 years before it happened. So in 1970, when Harold Schulweis came to this very synagogue and spoke from the Bima on Slichot of 1970, he spoke in a vocabulary. Forget about what he said. The way he said it said very clearly to the congregation, I'm here to talk to grown-ups. The truth is, he didn't like kids very much. He thought that they were kind of distracting. And he had a rule, by the way, and some of you, we tried to take this out of the brochures. The rule said you can't bring kids into my high holiday services. We took that out because we like kids. But Schulweis meant this. Schulweis said to the congregation, the only way to get children engaged in Judaism is for grown-ups to be engaged in Judaism. And if Judaism offers something to grown-ups, if the synagogue speaks to the life of grown-ups, then kids will want to be part of it. But you can't do it the other way around. So he would start speaking, and all of us would reach for our philosophical dictionaries. Like, what does he mean by ontological, or teleological, or metaphysical, or eschatological? And there were all these words that he would throw out, right? And you I'm not kidding, you were all here, right? And you had to know this, but he was trying to say something to us. And this was in 1970, 20 years before the rest of the community caught on, which is, number one, there are treasures here which you will want to have. They will change your life. And number two, your children will only adopt this if they see you doing it. This began to be the ideology of the community, but 20 years after Schulweis. And it was charted in a wonderful sociological and philosophical study called The Jew Within that was published in 2000. Take a look right here. The single most important finding of our study is decidedly double-edged. That's a great statement. That's a Talmudic statement. Double-edged means on the one hand, right? So put your thumb in the air. On the one hand, the American Jews we interviewed, they did a bunch of interviews of American Jews. They wanted to know what was the inner life of American Jews. The American Jews we interviewed overwhelmingly follow the pattern described by Bella and his co-authors 15 years ago in Habits of the Heart. That's a famous book from Berkeley. Don't forget about it. The first language that our subjects speak is by and large one of profound individualism. Their language is universalist, liberal, and personalist. Community, though a buzzword in our interviews, a felt need, even a real hunger for some, is a second language subordinate to the first. Our subjects, like Americans more generally, do not speak it as often or as well. Translation. In 1961, my family moved to Canoga Park, California, from Newark, New Jersey. We found a house that my father and mother could afford, right? My mother, on that very first day, made 3 stops. Number 1, she took my brothers and me to the local elementary school, public school, and dropped us off. Number 2, she went looking for a supermarket to buy food for dinner. Number 3, she went looking for a synagogue. For Mama, as for most Jews of that generation, belonging to a community, being part of a shul, participating in Jewish life, was as natural as breathing oxygen. You couldn't live without it. So right away, she went looking for a shul. And with the Kabakers, he found a small community forming. They were meeting in a house, and they moved in a VFW place, and they were in a Baptist church, and eventually they formed a synagogue and went into debt. You know, like most synagogues. That's what happens to that generation. My mother's a second-generation American Jew, right? Today, people don't come with that. They don't come reflexively to the synagogue. They don't come asking what they can give to the shul, right, to quote John Kennedy. They come asking what the shul is going to do for them. Why should I belong? What are you going to do for me? This individualism means that the center of authority is no longer in the community, and I want to join. The center of authority is right here in me. What are you going to do for me? Why should I belong? What will it do for me? It's always a for me kind of thing. That's what he means by individualism. The same behaviors and attitudes that we carry into the mall, or we carry into the business world, we carry into the synagogue. We are used to being consumers. And as a consumer, I'm looking for a commodity at a good price with good service and a nice environment, right? If I'm a consumer, I'm looking for the cheapest airfare to get where I want to go on any airline except United, right? If I'm a consumer, I'm looking for, I want to have a nice meal out in a nice restaurant where they're going to treat me nice. If I'm a consumer, I'm shopping. Well, people shop the same way. I'm looking for a sense of meaning in my life, a sense of purpose. There's many different places I can go in American culture. How is the synagogue going to compete with all the rest of them? I used to kibitz that we ought to amalgamate with Bally's Health Club. You know, we'll call it Bally's Beth Shalom, you know? Because they seem to have a better customer service model than we do, right? I mean, but the idea is, what do I get for it? What do I get for my consumer dollar and for the hour of time that I put into it? That's what he means by individualism. Look at the next line. Community and commitment, in fact, are repeatedly redefined and apprehended by our subjects in terms acceptable, and here's a wonderful phrase describing contemporary Americans: sovereign, ever-questing selves. Sovereign self means I control my own destiny. There's no commitment which defines me. Ever-questing means I'm never finished in the process of redefining myself. I'm always reconsidering my purchase choices, right? Right? So the famous story about the rabbi who has a guy who's coming to Shul Shabbos every week, and all of a sudden he stops coming, so the rabbi calls the guy, are you okay? He says, I'm fine. He says, well, you stopped coming to Shul. He says, yeah, that was that last year. This year we're doing horses. Now, it's a bad joke, but you understand the idea. Like, I'm finding my satisfactions elsewhere. That's what he's saying, right? They repeatedly reconsider which organizations and charities they will join and support, and to what degree, which beliefs they will hold, which loyalties they will acknowledge. The self is and must remain autonomous and sovereign. Don't tell me how to be Jewish. Now, here's the other side. Remember I said it was a two-edged sword? Here's on the other hand. On the other hand, yet here the postmodern story weighs in. Postmodern means you can be contradictory things in America. You can be a liberal Republican, or a conservative Democrat, or a vegetarian who goes to In-N-Out Burger every now and again. I know such people, right? You can be frum in the morning and go to Costco on Shabbos in the afternoon. If postmodern means I don't demand of myself consistency, I can have contradictory identities layered one on top of the other, right? Here the postmodern story weighs in. The labor of fashioning a Jewish self remains deeply significant to moderately affiliated American Jews. We can state with confidence that the quest for Jewish meaning is extremely important to our subjects, just as the search for meaning is important to contemporary Americans more generally. Middle-range American Jews seek an abiding significance in their lives that goes beyond the activities of daily life and the limits of their own mortality. They readily discuss their highly personal searches for transcendent meaning and confess, to a degree that surprised us, to a belief in God. Our subjects report a strong desire to find a sense of direction and ultimate purpose, and the wish to find it largely or entirely in the framework of Jewish practice and beliefs. Decisions concerning Judaism are inexorably wrapped up in the search for personal meaning. Let me tell you what this means. Ready? There's going to be a study that's going to be released very soon of Jews in the San Fernando Valley. It was commissioned by the Jewish Federation. I'm not allowed to talk about it, so the next 5 minutes, don't listen to. I want to tell you just one finding, which is not going to be a surprise. They interviewed a lot of people, they surveyed a lot of people, they tabulated the results. 94% of the people they interviewed said they're very proud to be Jewish. 94% said being Jewish is very important to me. 30% belong to a synagogue. 20% give money to Jewish charities. 10% are supportive of Israel in a very active way. Good night. Have a nice day. Just think of that for a minute. Being Jewish is really important to me. I'm really proud to be Jewish, but I don't. In fact, they even asked you, do you want to be more involved? 58% said yes, right? But they're not. They want to be involved, but they're not. They're proud to be Jewish, but they don't do anything with it. Jewish is important to me, but it doesn't mold or shape my behaviors. Paradox, right? Now, what is that paradox? First of all, we are now into our 4th and 5th and 6th generation of American settlement, of Jewish settlement in America, right? If your grandparents came in 1880 or 1914, that's first generation, you know, and your mom and dad were born in Brooklyn in 1925, that's second generation, right? And I was born in 1954, I'm third generation, and my kids are born in the 1980s and 90s, that's fourth generation, and someday if my kids get off the stick and give me grandchildren, I'll have fifth generation. I have sixth generation American Jewish kids in my nursery school over here. I told you this story, right? Avram and Surah Fagel came from Europe, and they gave birth to Morris and Muriel, who gave birth to Nancy and Steve, who gave birth to Jennifer and Brett, who gave birth to Ashley and Crystal, who gave birth and who brought to my nursery school just the other day, Avram and Surah Fagel, right? See, so we've covered the American part, right? We no longer have to name our kids Edward or Harold in order to become Americans because we're thoroughly American. And we've gone through this idea of survival because we realize, as your family did, that survival is not a practical, workable ideology. You've got to live this. You just can't declare for it. So now we've come to the point where we have to figure out what does living it really mean. That's where we are. And anti-Semitism no longer motivates. Anti-Semitism is not a factor. Israel may be a factor. History may be a factor. Identity is a factor. Community may be a factor. Now we have to begin to form and shape an American Jewish ideology. We really are at the precipice of this kind of moment. And either we're going to do it or we're not. If you're an optimist, you say, you're at the verge of a great American Jewish Renaissance. Because now that we're really free and prosperous and powerful and visible, we really are in a position to create the community that would, and the ideology we're really looking for. That was Harold Schulweiss's ideology. If you're a pessimist, and believe it or not, there are a few Jewish pessimists, you say, we're just going to assimilate out of existence. The truth is, they're probably both true. A large part of the community will probably assimilate out of existence, but the ones who remain are going to create something kind of new. So before we leave, let me give you two things that'll make you both chuckle and go, wow. First, Adam Sandler. When you consider the fact that anti-Semitism shaped the American Jewish experience through its first and second generations, and then all of a sudden a kid can get on national television and sing this song. And there are now three versions of it. This was the first one, which I think is still the best, right? He says, there's a lot of Christmas songs out there, but not too many about Hanukkah. So I wrote a song for all those nice Jewish kids who don't get to hear any Hanukkah songs. So here we go. Put on your yarmulke, here comes Hanukkah. It's so much funukkah to celebrate Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the festival of lights. Instead of one day of presents, we get 8 crazy nights. When you feel like you're the only kid in town without a Christmas tree, here's a list of people who are Jewish, just like you and me. This is on national television, right? David Lee Roth lights the menorah. He's a very famous rock and roll singer, in case you didn't know him. So do James Caan, Kirk Douglas, and the late Dinah Shora. Guess who eats together at the Carnegie Deli? Bowser from Sha-Na-Na and Arthur Fonzarelli. Henry Winkler belongs to Adon Ariel. That's Arthur Fonzarelli. And Bowser from Sha-Na-Na is that, anyway, never mind. He's another rock and roller. Paul Newman, this is the best line in the whole song. Paul Newman's half Jewish, Goldie Hawn's half too. Put them together, what a fine looking Jew. You don't need to deck the halls or Jingle Bell Rock, because you can spin the dreidel of Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. Both Jewish. In fact, most of the people in the cast of Star Trek were Jewish, right? Right? Put on your yarmulke. It's time for Hanukkah. The owner of the Seattle Supersonica celebrates Hanukkah. There was an article in the paper about how many major sports franchises are owned by Jews. A lot. The Dodgers are, anyway. O.J. Simpson, not a Jew. But guess who is? Guess who is? Hall of Famer Rod Carew. We got Ann Landers and her sister, dear Abby. Harrison Ford's a quarter Jewish. Not too shabby. And it goes on like this for a while. What does this song say? If you're an archaeologist and you find this 10,000 years from now, what are you going to say about American Jewish culture and civilization? You're going to say, what a powerful civilization this must have been. For a kid to get on national television, right? Not on a Jewish show. It's for Saturday Night Live, for God's sakes. And proclaim his pride. Yes? Boy or girl? Whoa, Mazel Tov! Well, go down, give me an Aliyah. Mazel Tov. She's okay? Sharon's okay? Yeah, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. We had a kid last night. It's one of my grand students. I raised him, so he had a boy. Yeah, I raised him. Then I bar mitzvahed him, then I married him, and they just had a baby. So I have a grand student. So what do you get it? This is a tremendous sense of pride. Turn the page over. This is another one. I got to get out of here. Andrew Lustig is a young American poet. And he's one of these sort of rapping poets. And he does this rap, and it's just remarkable. And what I want you to do is, as you read it through, I'll just read a little bit, but you can read it in. Look at the markers. Look at the markers, and if you took these markers and put them on a big board and drew a picture, look at the shape and contours of American Jewish identity. Look what it's made up of. About ethnicity, nationalism, religion, culture, pride. And just marvel at the fact that this kid is a fifth-generation American Jew. Right? I mean, there's a law in sociology that you learn called Hansen's Law. It's what we've talked about. Hansen's Law is the generation of the immigrants comes, and they speak the language of the old country, and they eat the foods of the old country, and they practice the customs. They try to make their American domicile, their American new life, just like it was back in fill in the blank. Poland, Cambodia, Vietnam, Tehran, Tel Aviv. Second generation, born in America, participates with their parents. You go to mamas and papas on Friday night to make Shabbos, but the rest of the week you live in an American life, right? Third generation respects their grandparents, isn't as worried about becoming American, isn't ambivalent about the American part, but really has given up most of the affectations of culture because they're separated from them, and by the fourth generation, it's all gone. There are no really dyed-in-the-wool Italian Americans anymore. Once upon a time there were. Once upon a time there was a neighborhood called Little Italy, and it really felt Italian, right? Or Chinatown, right? Today Chinatown is UCLA, right? Because, no, I'm serious, because Monterey Park to an extent, but Chinese immigrants are now in their third generation. They've assimilated into America, and they've become comfortable here like we have. And they worry about whether their kids are going to hold on to their Chinese culture, right? But now you got a fifth generation American kid who says this. Look what he says. I am the collective pride and excitement that is felt when we find out that a new actor, a great athlete, and his chief of staff is Jewish. I'm the collective guilt and shame. We find out that serial killer, that Ponzi schemer, that wife beater is Jewish. I am the Jewish star tattooed on the chest of the teenager who chooses to rebel against his parents' and grandparents' warning of a lonely Goyim cemetery by embracing that same Judaism, making permanent his Jewish identity. I am all the words in Yiddish I've been called all my life. I still don't understand. I am going to go all to 3 Fish shows. That's a rock and roll concert. I am my melody of Adon Olam. I am my melody of Adon Olam. The words may be the same, but I am my melody of Adon Olam. I'm not getting bar mitzvah. I am a bar mitzvah. I'm a concept foreign to the rest of the world. I'm not Judaism. I'm sleepaway camp. I'm your grandmother who's seen Chorkov and Auschwitz, who's seen 49 and 67 and 73, and who's tired of trying to make peace with those people who just want to blow up buses and destroy her people. I'm the 19-year-old who's seen Boudreaux's Don't Mess with the Zohan, Waltz with Bashir, those are Israeli films, who thinks, who knows, peace is possible. I'm the complicated reason you take the cheese off the burger you eat on a Saturday morning tailgate. I'm constantly struggling to understand my Jewish identity outside of religion. I am the Torah, not the Old Testament. I'm a kippah, not a skull cap. I'm a Jew, not an Israeli. 5,000 years, not 60. A religion, not a country. I'm never asked if I have horns or a pot of gold or if I rule the world or why I killed Jesus. I'm asked where my black hat is and if I really get 8 presents on Christmas, why my sideburns aren't super long. And if I've really never tried bacon, I'm asked what a gefilte fish is. I say, I don't know, I don't like it, nobody does. But we eat it because it's what we do. I'm asked if my dad's a lawyer. I say, no, my mom is. My dad's an accountant. I asked if my grandparents were in the Holocaust as if it were a movie. I say, yeah, they were, but luckily they were on Schindler's List. I am on JDate, not Match.com. Well, because it's just easier that way. I'm the feeling of obligation to buy the Dead Sea salt at the mall kiosk because you know the woman's Israeli. I'm an IDF sweatshirt and the chai around your neck. I'm a $100 challah cover you never use and a 5-shekel piece of red string you wear until it withers away. I'm your Hebrew name. I am your Israeli cousins. I am your Torah portion and your 13 candles. I'm your bar mitzvah dress and the cute Israeli soldier on your birthright trip. I am 18 when I discover that Israel is not actually a Garden of Eden of milk and honey where Jews of all backgrounds, ethnicity, styles of worship come together, eternally, happily appreciative to do a constant horror in the streets of the Promised Land. I'm still confident it will be. I am the way your stomach forgets to be hungry and your lungs forget to breathe when the rabbi commands the final Tekiah Gedolah. An entire congregation, a congregation that's not any one synagogue, but an entire people listens to what on January 1st is a ball dropping in Times Square, but today, any day in late September, early October, for the 577th time, is a ram's horn being blown into for what seems like 10 minutes, but would be 8 days of oil burning, and how David defeated Goliath, and how Moses parted the sea, and would have been enough, Dayenu, how we won the war, how your grandparents survived, Nes Gadol Haya Sham, Shana Tova, time for bagels and lox. I'm Jewish. Now, just listen to that, and tell me what quality of identity is that? That's called postmodern. Layered identities that that contradict each other. They all contradict each other, right? The kid who gets a Jewish star tattoo. Just think about that for a minute. The kid who takes the cheese off the burger at the tailgate party on a Shabbos morning. Just think about that. This layered, contradictory identity, but it's still offered up with such a powerful degree of pride. Okay? Only a living community with a great deal of depth and commitment creates this. This is not the manifesto of a dying community. This is the manifesto of a growing community. That's the miracle of the American Jewish community. Next week, we're going to go back to Torah, okay? Have a really good week. Shabbat shalom.